Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this panel. I'm sure everybody's read the biographies of our incredible panel here. I'm very, very excited. My name is Joanne Belknap. I'm a professor of ethnic studies here at the University of Colorado. Great students, and so great to see so many people at this. I want to have plenty of time for us to hear our speakers and for you all to have questions. Probably most of you are all aware of how this system works, that to ask questions into your cell phone, you text that number that is up here, 22333, and then UMCGMB, and that's how you register for each session. And you need to text leave at the end of each section if you've been in another room from the previous section. The questions will get cut off after 70 characters, and please don't send a question more than 70 characters. So, and then I'm going to be getting things up here. We're going to have, as I understand it, some cards for people who don't have cell phones and don't want to do it that way. And without further ado, and again, to save time, because I'm assuming you've read their biographies in the back of the program, I'm just going to tell you a fun fact that I found out about each of them this morning. And we are going to go in the order that is in the program. So first we have Athena Edmonds, and her fun fact is when she was not here, she was sneaking off to the Richard Simmons studio.
No.
Sadly, he wasn't there.
Richard Freeman.
Richard Freeman! Oh! My bad. I knew I was going to make a slip today. I thought, Richard Simmons is here? Whoops. And this would be live streamed. Okay.
No wonder she thought it was
funny.
funny.
I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah.
I thought, what, you were doing like a workout? Okay, sorry. Okay, Ellen Sweets. Her parents used to punish her by taking away her ukulele and radio and putting her in a room with a lot of books. They didn't have a television. She got punished a lot, so she became a very avid reader. Judge Thorne has been a soccer coach for kids as well as a women's college soccer coach. I know. And Jose Antonio Vargas has learned to speak English by watching the Golden Girls. Okay. So sorry about my mishap in my introduction, Athena, and you are going to kick us off.
All right. Hi. I'm here because my fourth child is a 14-year-old transgender boy, and I love him. So I'm going to talk about the personal for a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about the cost to the community, the state, and the nation. At 2, he climbed up on the kitchen counter when his dad and I were doing the dinner dishes. "I am so angry at you," he said. "Why?" we asked, confused. "I should have been born a boy," he answered. He refused to toilet train until we bought him boxers. Desperate for him to toilet train so he could start preschool at 3, we did. We were dismayed to see him freeze when he was asked to use pink scissors or line up with the girls in PE. And mortified to overhear other parents ask each other, what kind of parents would name a boy Natalie? In 3rd grade, when Nat's teacher asked us if he could please start referring to Nat with male pronouns because he learned better, we reluctantly agreed because we knew it was the right thing. After all his classmates already were. In 4th grade, our school forwarded our letter to his classmates' parents, announcing Nat's social transition into male pronouns and bathrooms. Due to the love and acceptance Nat has had in his extended family, school, and community, Nat is now a happy, well-adjusted, and popular 8th grader. However, everywhere from the healthcare system to the court system to the barber shop, we face discrimination. We're afraid to fly, we're afraid to get sick, we're even afraid to use the bathroom. Like most transgender children, my son still saves it all day. It's a habit he has developed to avoid using the girls' room when he was little because the girls would, he didn't look like a girl, and so when he went into the girls' room, all the girls would scream and make a scene and slam the door in his face, and so he wasn't able to go to the bathroom. We faced discrimination in the Massachusetts court when we petitioned 2 years ago for our child's legal name change. a standard procedure, we were told, especially when the family is intact and both parents agree. But that was not the case. Instead, we were summoned to court and told by the judge that our switching from a female to a male name raised multiple red flags for him in our parenting, and that he was assigning a guardian ad litem for that. He authorized a 25-hour investigation to be paid by the state and to start ASAP. In less than a week, the guardian had contacted us to request medical information. It felt as if we, parents of transgender children, lost our civil rights. In addition to this, in May 2014, our healthcare carrier discovered that our son was transgender and cut off our care. Our health provider called us 3 hours before our son's time-sensitive medical appointment to tell us that we were not allowed to come in anymore. We offered to pay out of pocket, but we were denied. It appears that when you have a transgender son, doctors are willing to violate their Hippocratic oath. That is why, like most parents of transgender children, we keep a safe folder to protect our families. In these safe folders, we collect letters from our doctors, neighbors, and school counselors as testimonies to our parenting. We collect photographs, drawings, and writings by our child, and letters and friends and extended family that document our child's atypical gender behavior through time. We're trying to be good parents to our son, and that's why I'm here. Our son is 14, and in a supporting community, he's thriving. He's a science fan, plays on the school soccer and ice hockey teams, and this year he's going to the national team Opti racing trials. He's looking forward to starting his own company when he grows up, and he deserves a bright future free from discrimination. But many kids are as lucky as Nat is, because he, not only because he's born into an accepting family, although it took quite a few years to become accepting, I have to admit, but only 43% of transgender kids are able to maintain their family bonds. 57% experience significant family rejection. In Massachusetts, 40% of the homeless youth are LGBTQ, and they are on the streets selling sex and drugs because they have no other way to survive. And that's actually the doctor that started the children's program at Boston Children's Hospital, and he said he used to work in the combat zone in Boston in a van and got to meet all those children that he called throwaways because they were early teens and they were selling sex and drugs, and they were transgender, and that's how he learned about them. It's also, even though we are able to access care, even though it was very difficult, it's extremely you have to be very educated and very privileged to access health care. 19% reported of transgender people reported being refused care outright because they are transgender. 28% postponed medical care when sick or injured due to discrimination and disrespect. 28% were subjected to harassment in medical settings. 50% of the sample, including us, had to teach our own medical providers about transgender care. We also, only 16 states cover transgender care. Colorado is one of the select few that does. And not covering care is, a huge problem to the nation, because they said for my son, when, we obviously were hoping he was not going to be transgender, but the statistics are for kids that identify as transgender and don't get the right treatment, the attempt suicide rate is 55%. Also, cutting is very high. But for kids, there's been a new study, longitudinal study, that have had intervention and medical treatment, which means they just go on puberty suppression for their adolescent, which means they don't go into the adolescent that they're allergic to, and like they do often for girls who get their periods too early. So it's something that they've been doing for height reasons since the 70s. Then these kids grow up to have the same mental health as the normal population and better. The suicide rate for trans people now, as things are, is 46%. I'm over my time, but I'm just going to briefly say there's also they have job discrimination. They have 73%. 90% reported experiencing harassment, mistreatment, discrimination at work. They have very low incomes, 4 times as likely to have a $10,000 income or below because they're kicked out of their jobs. And that's why 16% of transgender people are in the sex and drug industry. If you are a black transgender person, there's 47% have been arrested for doing nothing, just for being a black trans person. So this is why we need legal rights. We don't have civil rights in the country. Only less than 20 states have civil rights for employment, for housing. Colorado has everything. It's fantastic, but we don't have it for housing. We don't have it for employment. We don't have it for health care. The hospitals are full, the mental hospitals are full of these kids that are committing suicide, committing, cutting, and when I do healthcare training, no one asks them, do you have a gender issue? And it just keeps this thing going. Anyway, if I'm gonna pass it on to the next person. I'm out of time.
Hi, I'm often accused of politicizing everything. I can't help it. I have my own little version of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream notion, and my dream is that in the very near future, preferably tomorrow, actually yesterday, working class blacks, whites, Native Americans, lesbian, gay, transgendered people will all unite to vote against the people who have made it a practice to abuse all of us. And I say all of us because, let me just tell you, I'm originally from St. Louis. And for many years I worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And we looked at Ferguson on a regular basis and said, oh boy, when is that going to explode? And as we all know, it did. And when you talk about the cost, the high cost of bigotry in this country, look at Ferguson in microcosm. It costs an estimated $100,000 a day for 3 weeks for the city to maintain control. And then the feds came in because the governor finally realized he was sitting on a great big tinderbox. So you factor in the cost alone in our taxpayer dollars of perpetuating bigotry and just general unkindness, and the cost becomes more than just money. It pits us against one another. It makes us a laughingstock around the world where we're telling other people how they ought to treat their citizens, when voter suppression, not voter fraud, voter suppression is a big issue in 2016. We're going up to the November elections with way too many unkind dollars going into keeping other people from voting. So it isn't just about money. It's about decency and fairness, and that's my big concern.
Bias, I'm going to define as a predisposition to a view of a person or a group of people. And so the cost of bias, I think, can be spread out in several different categories, none of which I really count as money. Although you could certainly add a dollar figure to that if you were an economist and had those kinds of resources. First is young children. When your family and your community is subject to that bias, children have a hard time dreaming about things that are possible for them. They limit their dreams, or the people around them tell them, that's not realistic. You can't go to college. You can't run a business. You can't be a doctor. You need to get a good job. Now, our task really should be encouraging these young people to dream. Because without a dream, how do you go forward? My daughter, when she was 6, wanted to be an astronaut. She was never going to be an astronaut. She had had tubes in her ears. She was never going to pass the physical to be an astronaut. But we put a huge mural on her bedroom wall of the space shuttle. When she changed in a couple of years and wanted to be something else, we supported that. Our job was not to guide her in one place or another. Our job was to encourage her to dream about what was possible and what she would like to do. Bias limits kids' ability to dream because of the homes they grow up in that are impoverished. The community tells them that that's not possible for you. They unfortunately pick up the message from the world around them about what's possible and what's not possible. Businesses and governments suffer the cost of bias when they miss the opportunity for a new perspective. One of the people who I've heard speak, who I just absolutely enthralled by, is a business consultant named Lou Tice. And he claims to have 800 of the Fortune 1000 companies as clients, and so he teaches the captains of industry how to solve problems. And he maintains that within every problem, there's a solution already embedded, but that you need to have different people, different perspectives around the table so that you can see what that problem is, and then it's easier to identify a solution. If we all see the same thing, we're missing something. So he views diversity not as political correctness. He says he has no use for diversity as political correctness. He sees the value in problem solving. That when you look at something from different perspectives, no one may be correct. But if you listen to all of those perspectives, you'll be able to triangulate on what the problem is and make it easier to find the solution. So here's a guy who makes obviously big bucks helping people understand diversity as a problem solving, not as political correctness. And then I think there's a cost to the country that a lot of people underestimate. And that popped out at me when I read an article recently that was entitled, "Those Accustomed to Privilege Perceive Equality as Persecution." I think that may be part of what drives the anger that is supporting a particular presidential candidate. That if you're used to just the unthought about privilege of being able to go in and get a job, and now you're competing with other people for a job, and when you don't get that job, it feels unfair. It doesn't feel like there's a level playing field anymore. Well, that's because the playing field never was level. So again, let me repeat the title to that article, because it took me a couple of times to get my mind around that. Those who are accustomed to privilege perceive equality as persecution. And when we try to realign the playing field, that causes disruptions, because people's world changes, and it changes in a very personal way. It's not just politics over there. It changes in a personal way when it affects their opportunities, when it affects the opportunities for their children, when it affects their neighborhoods. And those tensions are natural. But the question for the country really is, do we want to manage those tensions as we're realigning the field? Or do we want to wait for something like Ferguson to simply say, this is unacceptable? It's sort of like not going to see the doctor until things are really bad. By that time, the cost to both you and the system are much higher than if you manage things as you go along. And one of the things that I've observed are that when people are unfamiliar with other, quote, types of people, they tend to be afraid. Or they tend to focus on one act or one dimension. They don't see people in the whole context. People I know, when they get angry, I see that anger in context of a person I've seen not angry, who we carry on a discourse with. And when they become angry, it's not because they're, quote, an angry person or they're a threat. It's just that's one part of who they are. But when you only encounter people when they're hostile, and I have to put police officers in that model. That's a tough job. But if you're on the streets of a community that views you as an outsider or an occupier, and you see hostility all the time, you tend to view people in one dimension. So I think bias is that ability to view people in one dimension, one act or one characteristic, because you don't have the context to wrap that act and that characteristic in. So people are not one-dimensional. And if we can step beyond that, I think that'll be a step beyond the bias that we all have about the unknown or the unfamiliar. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, good morning. I'm a little bit under the weather, so I apologize if my voice is a little messed up. I have to say, by the way, can we give another round of applause to Athena? I was just...
Thank you.
I think it's really rare to hear a parent from the perspective of a parent, which I thought was extraordinary. And thank you for being so vulnerable and specific. I think when I think about how people get enlightened, not just informed, but enlightened, I think that's what happens when they listen to something so vulnerable and so specific. So thank you again. And you actually, I was thinking about what I was going to say to this panel, and then you spoke, and so you kind of changed what I was going to say. I was gonna because I'm getting really tired of talking about myself. I made a film that is basically all about myself. It actually, at one point, the first time I was in Boulder was when the film screened at the film festival here, which is an amazing film festival. It's really a spectacular film festival. And the film, it's on Netflix, you can check it out, it's called Documented, is really, above all, I think, what happens when a family is separated by immigration, right? My mom sent me here when I was 12. That was 23 years ago. I haven't seen her since. I am waiting for quote unquote immigration reform, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. There's no immigration reform though right now. We are, far too busy talking about building walls and talking about Mexico. I'm from the Philippines. To talk about immigration reform. Right now, the only thing that would give some sort of relief is President Obama's executive order on immigration, which will be debated on the Supreme Court April 18th. I'll actually be in DC. I'm part of the amicus brief, basically petitioning the Supreme Court to let the president's executive order go through. This executive order would expand a deferred action program. Again, these are all very, perfect DC talk speak. Deferred action actually means deferral from deportation. So instead of deporting us, you give us parole. So I'm one of the 5 million people waiting to be given deferred action and deferral from deportation. And if this happens, if the president's executive order goes through, which we're not going to know probably until summer, the hearing is April 18th in DC. If it goes through, I'll be able to get parole and be able to go to the Philippines for at least a couple of weeks to see my mom and my sister and my brother. If it doesn't go through, we don't know. And I'm getting to this point now, whatever happens, we know that in this Donald Trump, Ted Cruz tornado, that whatever is going to happen with immigration is going to be an election issue. And since it's a Supreme Court, it's politicizing the Supreme Court, right? I have to tell you, to be perfectly honest, and that's why listening to Athena kind of made me, I'm trying to understand this from the perspective of my mother, who I only speak to on Facebook chat and sometimes Skype, although even that is hard because, how do you talk to somebody you haven't seen for 23 years? It's just there's no connection there. We just pretend, I think. I pretend. I think when she says, I miss you, I love you, I'm praying for you, I think she means it. I have to just kind of go, yeah, I miss you too, I love you, I want to see you. But I don't really know what that means because I've been so numb to all of this, I've just been numb. And so I don't really, not having a mother, feeling completely unrooted, feeling like I always have to defend myself as an undocumented gay Asian person with a Latino name who majored in black studies. Whatever. And I just made a film called White People, so that really confuses people. And I guess I just kind of want to bring it back to that idea of, I don't know what else you want from us. I do not know what else you want from us. You've detained us, you've deported us, you've separated our families, you've called us names, you've taken our money, because you take our money, you're happy, perfectly happy with that. You take our labor, all of that. 180,000 undocumented people in the state of Colorado, all of that. So I don't know what else you do. I don't know what else you want from us or you want us to do. Right? But what I do know is the question now becomes, how are you going to save yourself? How are you going to stay awake? How are you going to get awake? How are you going to get involved? One last thing about this. So I made this film, as I said, and we've been screening it across the country. And at one point, during kind of the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm so happy is happening, because I think it's forcing us to really contextualize what we're talking about when we talk about America, right? We like to say that America is a country of immigrants, and I always find that very insulting to Black people and Native Americans. Country of immigrants, wait a second, what about Black people and Native Americans? Where do they fit in that equation or that myth that we like to purport? So we showed the film, and then this young Black African-American man got up. It was at the University of Minnesota, and he said, you know, Jose, I'm really conflicted here. You know, I want you to be a citizen. I think you deserve it. But I'm born in this country. You know, my parents, my grandparents were from here. We migrated, the Great Migration from the South to the North, ended up being in Minnesota. But sometimes I feel like I'm barely treated as a citizen of this country. So I don't know if I want that for you. I don't know if I want that for you. I didn't know what to say to him. Then a month later, we were in North Carolina, and this elderly African-American woman, after the screening, pulled me aside. And, you know, she just had this very spiritual bearing to her. So she says to me, I came here because I read about you. I'm like, okay, great. And then she says, when my great-great-grandmother got to Charleston, South Carolina, she was given a piece of paper called a bill of sale, saying that she's a slave. So can you connect the papers that you can't seem to get with the papers that my great-great-grandmother was given? I didn't know what to tell her. So we are talking about more than papers. We are talking about more than laws. Because, you know, how many laws have this country passed? Which is why, for me, this whole idea of even, you know, I'm friends with quite a few of the Black Lives Matter organizers. And one of them said something that was really interesting to me. He said, well, I don't know, Jose, about immigration reform being the end-all be-all. We got the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and we still needed the Black Lives Matter movement. So clearly immigration reform, you know, of course you'll see your mom, you'll get a work permit, maybe a driver's license, but that's not going to solve everything, right? So my question here, I think, for everybody in terms of personalizing this issue is, what do you tell your mom? You know, like, I don't really know. I'm 35 now. When I started doing this work, I was 30 years old. I didn't know how long it was going to take doing this work that I'm doing. And sometimes I wonder, like, maybe I should just leave. Like, if you don't want us here, okay, I'm going to go see my mom. I really want to go see the world. Since everybody think I'm Mexican, maybe I should go see Mexico. So I don't know. I don't know what else you want from us. I just hope that, you know, people wake up.
You know, hearing you say that brings me to another one of my dreams, and that is one day we all wake up and all the blacks and all the Native Americans and all of the Mexicans are gone. And you have to function without all of us. That day of absence might be a wake-up call. But I also want to say to the young people here, and I noticed that there's several school groups, that when I was your age, I was fortunate enough to have parents that took me to New York to the theater. And I saw one musical in particular that when I walked out of the theater, I had memorized the line, every single line to that song. And it's something I hope you take back to your schools, and I hope that you will understand the meaning of the lyrics. And the lyrics are, you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, a people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. And you take with you what lessons you want to extract from that. But I hope you'll remember that song too.
It's from South Pacific.
Oh gosh, let's give the panel another round of applause. What a great panel. Okay, I don't have a whole lot of questions here, but I'm going to go with one. This goes to the panel. How do we create bipartisan support for anti-discrimination?
I need to think about that.
One comment quickly is maybe, so if you think about it, the country is only going to get gayer, blacker, more Asian, more Latino, just demographically speaking, right? So more Asian, more Latino, blacker, gayer, more gay people will come out, more transgender people will come out.
Yeah.
All the women will break every barrier there is and should be broken. All women of all races. So what's left? Straight white men. The very straight white men who wrote all the laws, the very straight white men who control Congress, the very straight men that control every institution this country has ever created. So when you ask that question, I think of all the congressional members, right? I mean, one of the last bastions of white heterosexual male privilege is the United States Congress. Is it any surprise that they're having a panic attack? So, like, how do we convince them that all of these changes, I thought your quote was really incredibly, important. Like, how do we convince them that just because this country is changing doesn't mean, that you're necessarily going to lose your place. It just means that the world doesn't revolve around white people. It never did. You just forced it to be. And now we have to recreate that. And now we have to recreate that with your help, with the help of white people, right? I mean, that for me is like, I know it's a big thing to say, but I think that's kind of at the core of this struggle. How do we talk to straight white men and make them feel like they're included in the conversation? I don't want any more straight white men who feel like they have to go to Donald Trump because they feel that all these changes are happening and they're afraid. Don't be scared. Our food is really great.
I want to say I don't know how, because right now at our state house in Massachusetts we have a bill for public accommodations, transgender public accommodations, which is non-discrimination for bathrooms and healthcare. And so it has, the House and the Senate are Democrat, and so it has passed. We have majority there, and it's right now for the governor to say if he's going to go for it or not. And we've been trying to make appointments to see the governor for a year now, and he won't make appointments with us. He won't talk to us. So I don't know. So it's hard to have a conversation when you can't have a conversation. You're not given the opportunity to have a conversation. So
to make those changes, I think one of the things that's necessary and that's obvious is to vote. We need to get people who haven't voted to vote, and then we need to get people to understand what the issues' impact on them are. There are so many people that seem to be voting against their own natural interests. I mean, how do you get poor people to vote for a billionaire who says, I'm happy to be a billionaire, and you losers just need to copy me? And they vote for him. So I think that's one part. But another part of it that I'm not sure I would have seen 10 years ago is that some of the stronger supporters for LGBT issues are businesses. Businesses are now starting to do things like boycott North Carolina because of the just blatant discrimination. maybe we need to support those businesses, even if it's just an email or a sign on to the website and say thank you for taking a stand. Because people can scream about injustice, but for some reason when businesses do it, they pay attention.
Yeah, and I want to say you talked about unkind money to keep people from doing things, for discrimination, unkind money going in our election. I mean, right now with North Carolina, there's in that campaign, they're trying to keep people from going to the bathroom, and using the bathroom is a basic human need, and regardless of whether you're transgender, and everyone should be able to use the bathroom. And I know, like with my son, when he was still we hadn't transitioned him, so he had a girl name even though he looked like a boy. When he went to camp, because his school had a unisex bathrooms, but when he went to day camp in the summer, my husband and I took turns and we waited in the car all day so that if he needed to go to the bathroom, he sailed, and so if he got wet and fell in the water and it was freezing, like 40 degrees out, that he could, we could take him in the car and take him to another bathroom in another part of town so he could change, because he wasn't able to use the bathroom at the camp. And so, not because of the camp ever said he can't, but because the girls screamed and he hadn't transitioned yet, so he couldn't go in the boys' bathroom. So this bathroom thing is huge.
Apropos to what Bill said, I don't know if you all remember this, but I think it was 2013. The Georgia state legislature, poor Georgia, all these states that are still fighting the Civil War. Yeah. Georgia passed a law against migrant labor. If you weren't a citizen, you couldn't work. And their first harvesting season, they lost $300 million. And the farmers were scrambling to get to the labor lobbies and saying, please reverse that law. Let the workers come back. This country understands money. It doesn't understand decency and kindness quite as well. But when you start taking money out of people's pockets, they start to respond. And I think that's one of the things that all of us can do. Other than speak out when we hear someone make an inappropriate comment, don't spend your money where people don't do right about others. I understand that Walmart makes available products and services at a more affordable price, but Walmart also exploits people. And when you subscribe to businesses and services that exploit others, you become complicit. We shouldn't be complicit.
Thank you for these great answers. I want to read one of the responses and I'm hoping I'm not going to cry. Jose, do not leave. We need you. Since there are so many young people here, can you briefly tell your story?
Oh, yeah, I didn't do that, huh? So I came here when I was 12. My mom put me on a plane and sent me here from the Philippines to live with my grandparents. I thought everything was fine. They were naturalized American citizens, so, I found out when I went to the DMV when I was 16 that the green card that my grandfather had given me was fake. That's when I found out I was here illegally. This was in 1997, so there was no Google. I couldn't I couldn't Google what it means to be undocumented if you're not Mexican, because the media, all the media ever talked about was Mexican people, and even though the Philippines was a Spanish colony, I'm not Mexican. And by the way, can you imagine what hurt this has caused the Mexican community in this country, especially considering that Mexico used to own parts of the United States. When I travel all around the country, it's been astounding to me how many people just use the term illegal and Mexican interchangeably. Illegal and Mexican interchangeably. But so found out I was undocumented when I was 16. I was really fortunate because I went to school in Mountain View High School in Mountain View in the Bay Area, and basically every teacher was like a mentor. I ended up becoming a journalist right away because the only reason why was because I realized that when you write a story, you get a byline in the paper. So I figured if I can't be here because I don't have papers, at least my name could be on the paper. And it's really stupid. Actually, there's a woman here, Betsy. I'm sorry, I'm going to embarrass her. Betsy, can you stand up? So Betsy's sister, Judy Rachel Block, I worked with at the Mountain View Voice when I was in high school. She was so kind to me. She was so kind to me. So I was, I have to tell you, you're absolutely right that in this country, money speaks the loudest, more than decency and kindness. But I also have to say, as somebody who has been a beneficiary of kindness, I think we have to figure out how we can appeal to the greater good in people, which is so hard to do, right? So because of that, I was saved, and then I just became a journalist for many, many years. I did everything I thought I needed to do to be a successful journalist. And then 5 years later, decided that I've had enough of this lying and living in secret and in fear. So I came out as undocumented and risked my privilege. Because I actually think that's a really, really important point to make. When you have privilege, like, what do you do to risk it? Right? So I risked it and then basically subjected myself to the government. The government, President Obama has deported more than 2 million people in the past 7 years, more than any other president in the history of this country. Can you imagine, by the way, the first African-American president who was overseeing the largest expansion of LGBT rights, who was responsible for deporting more immigrants in this country than in any other modern president. But because maybe I'm an exception, I don't know, and I don't want to be an exception. They haven't deported me, so I don't really know what they want to do. But your point about the young people who are here, and I'm so happy that there are a lot of young people here. I just hope you know where you come from. I just hope you know where you come from, and I hope that you know what sacrifice was made for you to be here. The great sacrifice that was made by your great-grandparents, by your grandparents, by your parents, just to be here. I think in this country, we forget that. And I think we forget that American citizenship is not just something you're born into. It's something we actually have to all fight for, And I think for us to continue to be the country that we are, we have to remember that.
Thank you.
And citizenship has always been sort of an odd concept because most Indians didn't get to be citizens until 1924.
Isn't that crazy? Can you repeat that, sir? Native Americans
weren't given citizenship across the board until 1924.
There's a wonderful New Yorker cartoon earlier this year, one of the issues, and there's a white guy standing and talking to a Native American, and the Indian is saying, "What do you mean? I was here. Why don't you go back to England?" Think about it.
Oh, that's great. I would also love so many of your points and the point about voting. I have a CU graduate, or a student who graduated from here and had a wrongful conviction and can't vote because of her felony. And I like to say this: honor your vote. So much work that was done for different groups of people to be able to vote.
People died, had their homes burned, their churches burned, just seeking for the right to have a voice and a vote. And as Ellen said, there are people now spending big bucks to keep people away from voting. So if you don't vote, you're really sort of committing, in my mind, a sacrilege.
And a lot of the jury pools are picked from voter registration, so to have a jury of our peers, everybody needs to do that.
I want to add one thing, and also don't be afraid to talk to your legislator because that's their job, and especially if you don't agree with them on a certain issue, because when I'm doing LGBT work, a lot of gay people live in the same, LGBT people live in the same neighborhoods, and their representatives are already on board. But when you live in a district where you have one that's not on board, making those connections and building relationships with the one that you're not on board with, it sort of creates a conversation and opens the door to him learning more about the other side. So schmoozing is good with the opposite side.
I agree with Athena that too often people live in a feedback loop where they only talk to people like themselves who have the same values as themselves. And as long as you live in that closed feedback loop, ideas never percolate.
After years of being truly a fairly moderate person personally, because I was a reporter, I had to maintain at least an air of neutrality as I traversed the workplace. However, once I retired, I too came out as an angry black woman.
I'm sorry, I just have to comment on this. American newsrooms now at a local level are less diverse than when I started in journalism in 1998. There are less people of color reporting in newsrooms across America than there used to be in the late 1990s. At a time in which you need more people of color to actually contextualize these issues, it is actually, to me, a tremendous journalistic irresponsibility. I gotta tell you, if there were more Latinos working in American newsrooms and not Univision and Fusion and Telemundo, we would be talking about immigration at a completely different level. If more women were in charge of newsrooms, we would be having a different conversation about issues in this country. And that's really, I think, for me, at the heart of a lot of our problems is we can't see each other, And I have to say, by the way, as someone who ended up, I don't know how this happened, I was trained by black women at the Washington Post. It was always fascinating to me that whenever a black woman writes a story about race, they're automatically suspect because apparently they have an agenda or they're not objective enough. But when white people do it, it's reportage and it's analysis. When people of color do it, it's an agenda and it's an opinion. I think that is incredibly unfair.
There's so many great questions. I'm having a really hard time deciding here, but the next one I'd like to ask is please talk about what you think it means to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. What do you think it means to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America?
Okay, I think it's two things depending on what you bring into it. But unfortunately, people don't see one or the other. They're on one side of this or the other. One is patriotism, and I have no problem with that. I mean, Indians constitute a higher per capita rate of veterans in this country, and they have for 100 years. So despite the fact that the land has been stolen from us, we still fight to protect it at a much greater rate than any other group. But the second thing is the flag is a symbol for the ideals that we have as Americans, which is equality, which is representation, which is just like the Statue of Liberty. Send us your poor, your homeless, your teeming masses. People came here with a vision of making life better for themselves and their children. And just because you came in at one time period as opposed to recently, doesn't mean that you shouldn't have that same opportunity. So I think if people realize that pledging allegiance is more than just patriotism, which isn't bad, but it's a pledge to the ideals for which the flag stands. I mean, that's the words. The ideals for which the flag stands.
I'm Greek. I'm also a Greek citizen, and I came here to go to college, and I got my citizenship when I was pregnant with my fourth son and my fourth child, and I now cry when I have to pledge allegiance, because I'm so emotional, because I can't imagine in any other country that my son could be thriving and have a childhood the way he has, and he has been able to go to the business about being a child. I can't imagine that in any other country in the world, and I am so grateful, and I love it. I love America. So.
I don't. I did until God crept in. I understand pledging allegiance. But I used to do stuff like, say, one nation under Buddha, Allah. I mean, come on. No, people get so upset when you point out to them that our first 3 or 4 presidents were not supporters of religion in politics. So where did this come from? And who's imposing what on whom? So I'll go so far as to mouth the words, but under God doesn't come out of my mouth.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question I would like to ask the panel is, what would you say to the high school students? What advice do you have for the high school students in this room?
Just a couple quick words. Don't settle for second best. In terms of the way people are treated, in terms of the country you live in terms of the environment that you live in. Don't settle.
Be kind to one another. Kindness goes a long ass. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I have to tell you all. When I sent an email, I forwarded an email to my daughter. My daughter's 45. She lives in New York. And I forwarded the email that told about the conference. And she actually looked at it and she called me up and she said, "Mom, I see where you're on a lot of panels." And I said, "Yeah, isn't that cool?" And she said, "Mom, watch your mouth." And I said, "I will, Hannah, I really will. I'll do my best." And she said, "Yeah, but you know, Mom, sometimes your best isn't good enough."
We love your best.
I would say if you're struggling with LGBT stuff, be sure that you talk to your, if you have a GSA, or find peers. If you tell your parents, tell them to find a support group, or just connect with a community or online community. Because for us, originally when we realized there was no local community for transgender parents of transgender children, but there was nationally. So even if you're in a hostile area, there's always online support, and there's also and also advocate for yourself. And if you're a parent of one, role model advocating for your child by advocating at school.
2 things. So you're not alone. You're never alone. Whatever it is you're going through, somebody already went through it. Somebody has already transcended it, right? And somebody already surpassed it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the world does not revolve around you. And this is something that I really instilled to a lot of my nephews and nieces. You grow up in this Instagram, Snapchat world in which you think everything is I, me, and my, and you have a say. What a privilege that is to always have a say. I think in this country we over communicate, but we don't seem to connect. But to realize that you exist in a community of people. So in many ways, your life has to revolve around other people, right? Like, just because you have what you have doesn't mean that other people have it, right? So I think like being awake to your surroundings is so important. and making sure to realize, like, I have to be really aware of this, that I can't talk about immigrant rights and not talk about LGBT rights and not talk about Black Lives Matter and not talk about women's rights and not talk about income inequality among all people. You know, all these issues are interconnected. And it's really important that we remember that.
Thank you. Ellen, I have a question directed to you. Do you think other countries are less bigoted than the United States?
I've only lived in one other country, and that was England, and it was in the 60s. And even in 1962, England was still recovering from the war. There were not as many immigrants then as there are now. And those who made it to England were pretty privileged. They were from the colonies, mainly India and Africa. And I was always braced for some slight. And there, the prejudice is directed more along class lines. So if you come from royalty, if you come from wealth, if you come from considerable privilege, you're assigned a more respectful place in British society. I don't know what it's like now, but I do look at our neighbors to the north. You know, we have a tendency to forget Canada's there. And Canada is, and it's ahead of us in many different ways and levels of tolerance, most notably. I mean, Trudeau went to the airport and handed out coats to Syrian refugees arriving, and I think it was Toronto. We do well. I think we could do better, but I'm just not prepared to say we are at the top of the heap across the board in our level of tolerance. I might be wrong. I was wrong last year at some point.
We don't believe it. To the panel, if you're taught to hate, how can we get meaningful education reform?
Me?
And to the whole panel, anybody. You'd be good. Anybody.
I believe people live what they learn. I believe we as thinking people, as sentient beings, can extract what's decent and what isn't. I really believe we can do that. The bigger question to me is, why don't more people do it? Why is it so difficult to be reasonable and fair? And I don't know any fancier words to use than that. I don't understand beyond the fact that there is a substantial percentage of this country that is still fighting the Civil War. And it has carried over into other parts of the country, especially where people are isolated and they only, as you all have said, only see people like them. What they perceive others as being is what is communicated to them in papers and on the news. And this is one of the reasons I'm writing a book about growing up in a black middle-class family that owned a newspaper, to demonstrate that there is an entire community that many white people know nothing about beyond pathology, sports, and entertainment. There's more to us than that. Thank God for Neil deGrasse Tyson. And once upon a time, Ben Carson as well, because, I mean, he was a sort of laughing stock in this last election cycle. But remember, this is the same guy that garnered international attention for an incredible surgical procedure that separated Siamese twins, I think, at the brain. I mean, that was really, and he did it. It was real. He was there. He did it. What happened to him after that, I don't know. But
because you're an expert in one field doesn't make you an expert in others.
Doesn't make you a presidential candidate.
I just have to say, though, like, back to the question about what do we teach our kids? You know, like, what do we So I made this documentary called White People, and I couldn't make this film without going to a Native American reservation. I just thought it was important that we do that. And I was totally, and I'm embarrassed to say that I'd never been to a Native American reservation. That was my first time. It was in Pine Ridge in South Dakota. But I was aghast when I found out that the history books that the Native American students, Lakota, mostly from the Lakota tribe, were reading and were being taught by all white teachers were history books that called Native American savages. Can you imagine? And then, like, what do we teach our kids about? You know, I have to say that, you know, I'm forever indebted to people like Harvey Milk and like what they have to fight, right? But how do we contextualize? Too often in the LGBT rights community, the emphasis has always been on gay men and less on lesbians and less on transgender people. And so I think that's something that we have to really figure out.
In our school, we had a sex ed training for the parents, so they get to understand about gender identity and transgender, because now we have a few transgender students, and we also have gender queer with children that go by they in middle school. And so we had to educate the parents. And I went to that group, and it was a lot of like the people that were like struggling with it or in that community. And then we also had race training, and I noticed that decided to go to it, and I noticed that all the people there were also, again, people that had mixed families, or you know, were of color. And I realized for the first time, as people had conversations, that it was sort of the same thing, but we were just talking about, you know, a different issue, but it was just the same sort of, we all talked about the same stuff. And it was interesting that the teachers talked about that they had parents resisting what the teachers wanted to teach. Like, they wanted to teach about sex ed, and the parents are resisting because they say, aren't fifth graders too young to know the word transgender or gay or whatever? Then they have parents resisting them talking about slavery, because isn't that too like stressful for my kid? And so that's what they, you know, that's what was being talked about. So, you know, I think teachers should ignore some of the parents. So.
I think you also need to keep a close watch on your textbooks, parents, grandparents, students. I'm assuming that you all by now know that much of the information that goes into textbooks that are distributed across the country come from, take a deep breath, the Texas Board of Education. Now, you know, having just moved from Texas to San Francisco, having lived in Texas for a total of almost 20 years, let me tell you, you must not trust the Texas School Board. This is the school board. Earlier this year, a mother discovered that her son's civics textbook said that Africans were brought from Africa as immigrants to work on farms. They were immigrants. And a woman brought this to the nation's attention, and she was interviewed on, I think, every network, including PBS. She caught it, and she raised the question, and the publishers now destroyed those books, and they're reintroducing them with the word slavery included. Watch your textbooks.
How that happens is most school districts, each district decides what texts they're going to buy. Mm-hmm. But in Texas, it's done at the state level. So they have such a vast printing of that the incentive of the publishers is to please the Texas because it's such a big customer, as opposed to Boulder, which is a very small customer. Yep. So what Ellen is saying is exactly true for economic reasons, and so we need to pay attention to those. The other thing is that the very conservative movement, as they were getting involved in politics, the first things that they ran for office for, local school boards.
Yes. Library board. Yeah.
The two things I want to say about education. One is because of where I come from, education is sort of a two-edged sword because of the history of the Indian boarding schools, where for 100 years education was used as a means not to educate, but to separate children from their culture, from their language, and even worse, from their families. So that you have lots of problems, and I could talk for several hours about what those are that came from the boarding schools. But just as we deal with education, we need to make sure that we use education to lift people up, to bind them together, to make them more aware of the world around themselves and their own value and place in that system. Second thing I want to say is, and I'm surprised I'm going to say it, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it because I see my sister sitting out there, is that there's something my dad said that had worth, and I don't agree with him on very much. But he sent us to private school, to parochial school, and he never bitched about paying property taxes for public schools. And it was because he said, my children are going to live next door to those children. And it's in their advantage to have educated neighbors. So it's not, if we think about it, it's not just about me, but it's about the people that we want to live next to and that we want our grandchildren to live next to. That's why we have to educate in quality schools and provide good quality education, because it's in our own best interest to have good neighbors.
Back to that point, by the way, so since I can't leave the country, I've been traveling all across the country. So I've been to all the states except Montana and Alaska the past 5 years. And
you left out the most beautiful ones there.
I know. I'm trying to get Sarah Palin to do an immigration event with me in Alaska. She hasn't said yes yet. There's a lot of Filipinos in Alaska. I don't know why, but there are a lot of them there.
That's because she's throwing rocks at Russia.
But my point is, I always have known that this country was divided. I just didn't realize how divided it was until I spent a month in Arkansas, Wisconsin, Ohio, Alabama, and places where the Civil War is still being fought, and they have barely dealt with the black thing, and now you're adding the Latino and the Asian thing right on top of it, and the gay thing right on top of it, right? So it's really like crazy what's happening. But because of that, I've decided that I only do Fox News. I don't do MSNBC, I don't do CNN anymore. Because first of all, the viewership is not that high, but Bill O'Reilly and Megyn Kelly reach a lot of people. And my goal is, how do I get myself, because believe me, it's uncomfortable, right? To be subjected to Bill O'Reilly's rants. I just think of him as like my cranky uncle. Megyn Kelly is actually pretty fair to me, but I do this because the people that really need to hear from me are the people who watch Fox News. And I get really worried, I have to tell you, us in the health of our country, when we make blanket statements like hating Republicans and hating Fox News and you can't hate something you don't know, right? And I think we have to be really careful about that. I grew up in quote-unquote progressive communities my entire life, and I feel as if within the progressive movement there's a lot of like pat in the back, kind of like, oh, aren't we the enlightened ones that know everything? Where does that get us? Like every day I wake up and have to remember that people don't think about me when they wake up. They don't think about my mom. They think about themselves, and they think about surviving. So how do I connect my struggle with their struggle? the struggle here, listening to Ellen as well do this, is like, I would argue that we have never fully told the history of this country. We have never fully told the history of this country and the struggle for equality that was never there. That's why the Black Lives Matter movement to me is so revealing, because when people say it, people automatically think it's some sort of an attack, right? People automatically have to say all lives matter. People have to say, wait a second, white people face discrimination too. I'm like, I'm sorry, was that written in the Constitution somewhere? Like, right? Like, so I would argue that we have not had, that we are, you know, remember when when Obama was elected, I was covering him at the Washington Post. I remember how my mostly white colleagues in the political press corps were like, oh my God, post-racial America. I remember sitting there going like, yo, it just got started. The racial conversation in this country just got started. And unless we are willing to talk to people who don't agree with us, who don't look like us, unless we're willing to get a little more uncomfortable, we're not going to get anywhere. There's going to be far more division than anything else. So we have to force ourselves to do that. You know, that's why I do as many Republican Tea Party events as I can. That's why I only go on Fox News. I think we all have to do what we can to do that.
Very well said.
You know, for many years I was a reporter for the Denver Post, and it always amused me because I would go to cover events. And I mean, come on, we know what the black population of Colorado is. So I'd go along to these events, and I'd go someplace, and I'd cover them, and I'd interview people, and I'd write the story. And I'd go someplace else, and I would, same demographic. The only other people usually at some of these events were you know, serving drinks. And and they would say, oh, do you remember me? And I'm thinking, no. And in the back of my head, I'm fighting, saying, you know, after a while, all you white people look alike to me. But I don't say it, I don't believe it, I don't feel it. But, you know, here I am, this little ink spot in all of this, you know, this social stuff. And I mean, it's true. Until, you know, as you said, until we see ourselves more in a broad spectrum of venues, we don't know. We don't know other people. So, yeah. Yeah. Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer.
To change gears a little bit, a great question. Would you talk about the bias to the mentally challenged?
Several decades ago, there was a very laudable movement to get mentally ill people out of state hospitals, which were really not very good institutions and did not do a lot of therapy or other things. It was basically custodial, and it was basically secure confinement. So there was a laudable effort to get people out of that situation. What should have happened is that we then wrapped around community mental health services to help them live in a non-confined situation, but with the aids they needed to be able to live and function independently. That didn't happen. Our budgets weren't made available. People were basically turned loose. They ended up basically a lot in the homeless communities, a lot, and unfortunately now, instead of housing people in the state mental hospitals, we house them in prisons. And instead of providing some wraparound services at some cost, we pay $60,000 to $80,000 a year to house inmates. And that's one of the, I think, the perversities of our system, is that in the name of helping them in one situation, we put them in a situation that's much, much worse, much less cost effective, if he would just wrap community mental health services. But as I speak to judges all over the country about reforming the juvenile system including the juvenile delinquency system, the biggest single thing they say over and over that they lack is community mental health services. To be able to keep those kids, those adults, home, not locked up, and as neighbors, not as people you throw away and you lock away.
Well, I just want to add that until a few years ago, when, like, for example, 10 years ago when I realized my son was transgender, at the time it was a mental illness, and it had to be diagnosed and treated. And so, you know, at the time, it was a choice, like, if we needed to, you know, most parents were fixing them. And so it's, you know, it wasn't until like a few years later that, you know, only a few years ago that it became gender identity disorder, so that it's not a mental illness. I don't think they should call it that, because when kids are treated, there is no mental illness. But the world is full of children in the hospital or in jail who are transgender because of lack of treatment. So,
Athena is right about being careful about what we call mental illness and services. It's not uncommon, at least in the juvenile court, to get reports about children and you call them oppositionally defiant. And there's two ways of interpreting it. One is they're teenagers. The other is sometimes crazy behavior is a perfectly rational reaction to a crazy situation. And we shouldn't be labeling kids. We should be trying to figure out, how did this happen and what can we do about it?
Well, yeah, if you think about it, it's only been relatively recently, I think maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, that homosexuality has been dropped as a mental illness. Oh, the APA?
And only in some states.
Really?
There are some states that still label that.
Despite the APA redefinition. Huh.
Is affirmative action an effective policy for changing U.S. culture?
You want to talk about affirmative action? European settlers coming here and taking this land as affirmative action. Colonizing and imperializing all of these countries, that's affirmative action. I think we have to be very, very careful and much more analytical when we describe these terms, especially given the lack, you know, what's happening now because of the attack of an affirmative action. We now have less students of color, Black and Latino students, going to colleges, you know. We can't all serve your kids and mow your lawns and babysit your kids. We can't all be your labor, or is that what you want us to do? You know, I mean, I think that's a really serious question. And what's happening now, too, is the Asian American community is being used to justify opposition to affirmative action. Asian people are saying, oh, well, you know, the Asian people don't need affirmative action, so why do the Blacks and the Latinos need it? And we have to be more vigilant in the Asian American community to not be used, right, so that you can justify opposing affirmative action programs that are so crucial in trying to figure out how do we actually, white people have been getting affirmative action since the beginning of this country and still does. When I go to Harvard and I realize that most of the people, I finally did this, I don't think they're ever going to invite back to Harvard. And I started realizing, wait a second, I'm speaking to a room full of affirmative action recipients. You're here because your great-great-grandparents got here and your parents got here and they gave this gift to the universities. So how dare you go to us and say, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, you're not good enough, study harder. You know, I mean, we have to be more, especially now in the post-Obama era, because back to your point to Ellen, like, I have to really control myself. This is me not controlling myself. Oh shoot, is this being streamed?
Yeah.
Because, you know, like, there are many people that like, when I especially when I'm in the South, who actually believe this, who say that, wait a second, racism is over, we've had Obama, and look where that got us. I mean, that's the danger now, right? Is like, we tried that, it didn't work. So now, what are you gonna do? Now, mind you, is it any surprise that, in the same time that the Obama presidency happens, you see the criminalization and deportation of immigrants in this country? Right? In the South, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina. If you're an undocumented student in the state of Georgia, you can't go to the top 5 schools. If you're an undocumented student in the state of Alabama, you can't go to any of the colleges at all. Right? So since the person that they used to call boy is now in the White House, they want someone else to blame. And they're the immigrants. So this is the kind of, and again, I got to tell you, the failure of journalism in covering these issues is in many ways at the heart of why we don't know what's happening. And yelling on television is not journalism. I mean is not journalism. And so we have to figure out, like, how are we gonna get more informed on these issues?
I have to laugh every time I hear some rant about people coming to this country and taking jobs away from Americans. Couple of things. Not too long ago, I read an article about Boeing, in Seattle, having something like 500 jobs going begging because they couldn't find locals who could qualify for the reading and math required to deconstruct and apply the specs for this highly technical field. And people in Seattle were complaining about the fact that all of these Indians and Chinese people were taking jobs away from them. And then I thought about the time Stephen Colbert had a representative on from the United Farm Workers who talked about how it was so difficult to get white Americans to work in the fields, that they would come, they would go to work, and in 2 days they were gone because it is back-breaking work. I understand that we are a well-to-do nation. I understand that we are, in many ways, a fairly well-educated nation. But we are also, in a lot of ways, a very lazy nation. We do not want to do the back-breaking work that we feel others ought to do, but we don't want them in this country. When I lived in New Jersey, in Jersey City, there was an East Indian, husband-wife team. He was a family practitioner. She was OBGYN. And there arose such a hue and cry about them serving this very poor white Jersey City community. And somebody got a wild hair and started throwing rocks at their houses and breaking their windows and telling them they should go back where they came from and that they were taking jobs away from people in this little community in New Jersey. And after a while, the husband and wife team said, "No mas. Okay, you don't want us here. We're gone." And they moved their practice to a more affluent community, leaving 250,000 people without medical care in that community. Okay, be careful what you ask for.
We only have 1 minute left. I really want to, this panel has been amazing. You've been a great audience. I'm sorry I didn't get everybody's questions in. If there's last thing anybody wants to say, but thank you so much. What a great panel.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to be educated by you and for the opportunity to talk about transgender civil rights. So thank you.
I just want to pledge, Athena, that we are all with you and that we will be as vocal as we can in our own communities and our own networks so that you know that we are with you in this fight. And that thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, and thank you for your educating me about immigration, which I didn't know about. Thank you.
And I think all of these panelists have demonstrated that the way to change people's behavior is you have to open their hearts first.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. I thoroughly enjoyed your. Oh,
Since I've been here, and clearly a transgender person coming out, and I just said hi. He said hi. That was that. You know, I mean, why do I care? Really, you know?
Ina, this is my card.